Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Today we are undertaking a deeply comprehensive examination of the Second Bulgarian Empire. So we are looking at a state that spanned from 1185 to 1396, and this deep dive is a core part of our Bulgarian history series.
Right, and it's a massive topic. We are synthesizing a vast array of sources here, historical chronicles, modern medieval studies, archaeological findings, and numismatic records to really reconstruct this era.
Exactly. And the mission today is for you to map out exactly how a seemingly localized, kind of mundane tax dispute against the mighty Byzantine Empire escalated into the creation of a major European power. I mean, a power that ultimately shaped the cultural and religious landscape of the entire Orthodox Slavic world.
Yeah, and to really grasp that, it requires looking closely at a region that had been entirely absorbed by the Byzantine Empire for, well, nearly a century and a half at this point.
Right, it's not a short period of occupation.
Not at all. So to go from a fully subjugated province to an empire claiming the mantle of a new Constantinople, that requires a very specific and highly volatile set of circumstances.
Because if you look at the Balkans in the late 12th century, the Byzantine grip just feels permanent, right? They've controlled the Bulgarian lands since 1018. That is generations of entrenched administrative rule.
Oh, absolutely. The local populations had never known anything else.
So when Emperor Isaac II Angelos levies a new tax in 1185, it doesn't immediately signal an empire-ending event. Governments tax their provinces. That's just the fundamental nature of an empire.
Sure, but the context of this specific levy, that's what actually fractured the administration.
Yeah.
Isaac II Angelos was attempting to manage this highly centralized, incredibly expensive state apparatus directly from Constantinople.
And the treasury was hurting, right?
The treasury was under immense strain. The empire was facing active military pressure from the Normans in the west and the Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor.
Which makes sense. I mean, if the Normans are threatening the borders, a defensive tax might be easier for the local populations to accept. You pay the administration so you don't get conquered. But that wasn't the justification for this tax, was it?
No, not at all. The immediate catalyst was actually a royal wedding.
Right.
Isaac II was marrying the daughter of King Bela III of Hungary. And to finance the lavish celebrations, the feasts, and all the associated imperial pageantry, he imposed an extra, severely heavy tax burden.
And they didn't spread this tax evenly, did they?
No. The central administration chose to lay this burden disproportionately on the populations living in the Hemus Mountains. So, in the province of Moesia.
Let's consider a modern equivalent for a second. Think about a distant federal government imposing a massive, crippling levy on a struggling rural farming county, purely to fund an extravagant state gala back in the capital. It's completely out of touch. Did the Byzantine administration fundamentally misunderstand the economic breaking point of their frontier provinces?
They absolutely did. They viewed the periphery strictly as a resource extraction zone. And this brings us directly to Peter and Asen.
The brothers.
Right. Theodore, who later takes the regnal name Peter, and his younger brother Asen. They were local nobles known as boyars, operating in the Tarnovo region.
And when this tax comes down, they don't immediately start a war.
No, they decided to travel to the Byzantine military camp at Kypsela in Thrace to petition the emperor directly.
So they are operating entirely within the established system. They go to negotiate.
Exactly. Their request was entirely standard within the Byzantine feudal framework. They basically asked to be officially added to the role of the Byzantine army, and they requested a specific land grant, a pronoia located in the Hemus Mountains.
Let's clarify the mechanics of a pronoia here, because it's important. It's not just the emperor handing over an empty field, right?
No, a pronoia was a grant of revenue. So the emperor temporarily transferred the rights to collect state taxes from a specific piece of land and from the peasants living on it to a noble.
And the noble gives something in return.
Right. In exchange, that noble provided military service. So Peter and Asen were asking for a pronoia so that the revenue generated from it would allow them to actually meet the new oppressive tax obligation.
They were attempting to integrate themselves further into the lower rungs of the Byzantine apparatus just to survive the financial demand.
That's all they wanted. But the Byzantine administration completely misread the situation. They refused the request entirely.
And it wasn't just a polite refusal.
Far from it. It was a bureaucratic refusal that escalated into physical violence. During the ensuing argument, a high-ranking Byzantine official actually struck Asen across the face.
I mean, that physical slap is just a profound breaking point. You have local leaders coming to ask for a slight administrative concession to help them enforce the emperor's own tax. By assaulting them, the Byzantine court is stripping away any illusion of partnership.
They fail to recognize that local nobility, like Peter and Asen, were the crucial intermediaries keeping that frontier compliant. By humiliating them in such a public, visceral manner, the central administration effectively untethered the province of Moesia.
They demonstrated that the boyars had no status.
No status, no recourse, and just no future within the Byzantine system.
So the brothers return to Tarnovo and they initiate a rebellion. But from the sources we're looking at, they don't just start handing out weapons and organizing militias. They launch a deeply sophisticated ideological and religious campaign to legitimize the uprising.
Which was necessary. A rebellion against the Byzantine emperor who, was viewed as God's representative on earth that required divine sanction to succeed.
Right.
It couldn't just be a tax revolt. It had to be framed as a holy war of liberation. So in Tarnovo, Peter and Asen commissioned the construction of a new church dedicated to St. Demetrius of Thessaloniki.
Why St. Demetrius specifically? There are, hundreds of saints in the Orthodox calendar they could have picked.
St. Demetrius held immense cultural and theological weight. He was a premier military saint in the Orthodox tradition, usually depicted as a warrior. But crucially, he was the traditional patron protector of the major Byzantine city of Thessaloniki.
So they are actively co-opting a Byzantine patron saint. How do you convince a medieval population that a saint has literally changed sides?
Well, they presented a highly celebrated icon of St. Demetrius in their newly constructed church in Tarnovo. And then they publicly proclaimed that the saint had actively abandoned the Byzantines.
Oh, really?
Yes. The narrative they spread was that St. Demetrius was so disgusted by Byzantine corruption that he left Thessaloniki and traveled to Tarnovo to support the cause of the Bulgarians and the Vlachs.
They declared that God had definitively decided to free them from the Byzantine yoke.
Exactly.
It is an incredibly effective form of psychological mobilization. You tell a highly religious populace that the enemy's own patron saint has defected because your cause is righteous.
And that religious fervor provided the necessary catalyst. The rebellion rapidly gained momentum. The rebel forces began attacking Byzantine administrative centers, seizing prisoners, capturing livestock to fund their campaign.
They execute a highly symbolic raid on Preslav, right? Which had been the capital of the First Bulgarian Empire.
Yes, and that raid is a deliberate historical callback. They are connecting their current tax revolt to the legacy of a state that had been dead for over a century and a half. Following the raid on Preslav, the elder brother, Theodore, officially assumed the royal insignia.
He takes a new title.
He was crowned Tsar and deliberately took the name Peter. This was a direct invocation of the memory of the sainted Tsar Peter I, who ruled the First Empire during a period of great peace and prosperity.
And Constantinople obviously responds with military force. Emperor Isaac II Angelos sends armies to crush this.
Right. Initially, the Byzantine commander John Kantakouzanos achieved some tactical successes. He forced Peter and Asen to temporarily retreat north across the Danube River.
But that retreat was actually a massive problem for the Byzantines.
It was a strategic disaster because it allowed the brothers to forge a crucial new alliance. When Peter and Asen returned in early 1186, they brought foreign mercenaries with them,
which escalates the conflict entirely leading up to the spring of 1187.
Emperor Isaac II Angelos recognized that his generals were failing, so he took personal command of an imperial army. He marched into the region and laid siege to the highly fortified Bulgarian stronghold of Levich.
And sieges in this period are massive logistical undertakings. You have to feed an army while they literally sit outside a stone wall for months.
Exactly. And he besieged Levich for 3 full months. But the fortress held out. The Byzantine army began to suffer from severe logistical overextension. Their supply lines were constantly harassed by mobile rebel forces operating in the surrounding mountains.
So by the end of the spring, Isaac is stuck.
He is forced to lift the siege and offer an armistice.
And that armistice functions as the de facto recognition of the Second Bulgarian Empire. The Byzantines essentially concede that they can no longer project power into the lands between the Hemus Mountains and the Danube.
It absolutely marked the formal geopolitical birth of the state. And following this treaty, the younger brother, Asen, who had really proven himself as the superior military commander during all these campaigns, was elevated to co-ruler.
He becomes Ivan Asen I.
Yes.
If we look closely at this foundation, though, turning a successful local rebellion into a lasting expansionist empire requires a distinct military advantage. The Byzantine legions were highly organized and heavily armored. The Asen brothers needed something that could consistently break Byzantine formations.
And they found that advantage by leveraging the unique demographic makeup of the territory they now controlled.
Right.
The early Second Bulgarian Empire was not a homogeneous, single-ethnicity state. It was a complex, highly functional, multi-ethnic coalition.
Let's map out that demographic coalition for everyone. The largest group is obviously the ethnic Bulgarians.
Right. The ethnic Bulgarians formed the Slavicized agrarian base. So they were the sedentary farmers, cultivating the valleys and plains. They provided the demographic majority, the core of the heavy infantry, and, the personnel needed for administrative continuity and taxation.
Then you have the Vlachs. The historical sources describe them as a Romance-speaking people primarily engaged in transhuman herding.
And transhumance dictates a very specific lifestyle. The Vlachs moved their flocks of sheep between high mountainous pastures in the summer and lower valleys in the winter.
Which means they know the land.
Intimately. Because they lived this rugged, highly mobile life in the Hemus Mountains, they possessed just an unparalleled knowledge of the terrain. They functioned as excellent scouts, highly mobile light infantry, and local guides who could navigate passes that Byzantine maps didn't even show.
So the agrarian Bulgarians and the pastoral Vlachs form a solid foundation. But the absolute military game changer for this new empire was the addition of the Cumans.
The Cumans, also known in various sources as Kipchaks, were a North Turkic nomadic group. They originated from the Pontic steppe, so the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea.
Okay.
By the mid-11th century, large numbers of them had migrated westward toward the Danube. They were master horsemen and, crucially, master horse archers.
The medieval chronicles frequently refer to them as Cumani Bellatores, meaning Cuman warriors.
Right. When Peter and Asen retreated across the Danube in the early days of the rebellion, the Cumans were the mercenaries they recruited. The agrarian Bulgarians and the mountain-dwelling Vlachs, they could hold territory and ambush supply lines, but they lacked a devastating, highly mobile strike force.
Which the Cumans provided.
Exactly. They provided a lethal light cavalry component.
And this coalition becomes fully institutionalized during the reign of the youngest of the three original brothers, Kaloyan, who rules from 1197 to 1207.
Kaloyan was a master state builder. He understood that relying on temporary mercenary contracts with nomadic tribes was financially draining, and strategically it was unreliable.
Because they could just leave.
Right. To ensure the survival of the empire, he integrated the Cumans directly into the Bulgarian military and social elite.
Which is fascinating. How a sedentary European state integrates a massive influx of steppe nomads is a huge problem. Because if you look at the Kingdom of Hungary during this same general era, they also received large numbers of Cuman refugees, but their approach was entirely different.
Night and day difference. The Hungarian approach was highly adversarial and heavily focused on forced assimilation. The Hungarian crown implemented strict legislative frameworks, which were later formalized as the Articuli Cumanorum.
And what did that legislation actually demand?
They attempted to force the nomadic Cumans to sedentarize immediately. They wanted them to become tied to the land as farmers, to abandon their traditional felt clothing, and to drop their pagan practices essentially overnight.
You take a culture whose entire identity and military superiority is based on mobility and horsemanship, and you order them to become stationary plowmen.
It was a complete disaster. It caused endless internal friction, bloody rebellions, and deep civil strife within Hungary.
But the Bulgarian state, under the Asen dynasty, took the exact opposite path.
They did. There was no policy of forced ethnic assimilation. The Bulgarian administration recognized that the Cumans' value lay precisely in their distinct martial culture.
So instead of making them farmers, they make them lords.
Exactly. They absorbed the Cumans seamlessly into the military aristocracy. You see, in the medieval social structure, the only class that could readily accept and utilize nomadic warriors was the bellatores, the fighting nobility.
Right.
The Bulgarian state granted the Cuman leaders extensive lands and titles in exchange for permanent military service. They let them fight the exact way they had always fought.
And this integration reached the absolute highest levels of power, didn't it?
It did. Both Tsar Kaloyan and his later successor Tsar Boril actually took royal wives of Cuman origin to cement these alliances. Even the Asen family themselves carried names with clear Cumanic or Turkic linguistic roots, names like Asen, Boril, and Belgan.
Now, the Byzantine chroniclers coined a term for this. They called it a mixo-barbarian society, and they meant it as a derogatory insult, basically implying a corrupted, impure state.
While it was definitely intended as a pejorative, practically speaking, this mixo-barbarian structure was a highly effective synthesis. Kaloyan combined the sedentary administration, logistical capacity, and heavy infantry of the Bulgarians with the lethal, fast-striking cavalry tactics of the Eurasian steppe.
Which is a massive strategic advantage. By allowing the Cumans to maintain their martial identity and rewarding them with elite status, Kaloyan effectively manufactured a deeply loyal military class. The Cumans had a vested personal interest in the survival and expansion of the Bulgarian state, because their own high status and wealth depended entirely upon it.
And we see the ultimate devastating proof of this military synthesis at the Battle of Adrianople in 1205.
Let's set the stage for that, because the geopolitical map had completely shattered just 1 year prior. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, which was originally intended for the Holy Land, diverted to Constantinople.
Right. The Crusaders sacked the city. They completely dismantled the Byzantine Empire and established a new Catholic Crusader state known as the Latin Empire, ruling directly from Constantinople.
Now, Kaloyan had actually spent years leading up to this negotiating with the West. He had been corresponding with Pope Innocent III, seeking international legal recognition for his empire.
He was highly successful in those diplomatic efforts. In the autumn of 1204, a papal legate actually arrived in Tarnovo and officially crowned Kaloyan as King of Bulgarians and Vlachs.
So he gets the legitimacy he desired on the European stage.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the newly established Latin Crusaders in Constantinople, they do not respect this papal recognition.
No.
The Crusaders operated with immense arrogance. They claimed dominion over all former Byzantine territories, which, in their legal interpretation, included the entirety of Bulgaria. They refused to treat Kaloyan as a sovereign equal. They referred to him essentially as a rebellious vassal.
And Kaloyan responds by aligning with the local Greek aristocracy in the region of Thrace, who are currently rebelling against their new Crusader overlords. Kaloyan marches his army, which is heavily reliant on his integrated Cuman cavalry, south to the city of Adrianople.
He arrives to face the Latin emperor himself, Baldwin I. And you have to remember, the Crusader Knights were the premier heavy cavalry of Western Europe.
Right.
They were heavily armored, highly disciplined in close-quarters combat, and accustomed to launching massive, crushing charges that would just break enemy lines through sheer physical impact.
So how does a Mixo-barbarian army dismantle a force of heavily armored Western knights?
Kaloyan utilized classic steppe nomadic tactics. He held his heavy Bulgarian infantry back, utilizing the terrain by positioning them near marshland. Then he sent his Cuman-like cavalry forward to harass the Crusader Knights.
So the Cumans ride into range, loose volleys of arrows into the dense Crusader formations, and then wheel away before the knights can engage them in melee combat.
It is a deeply frustrating tactic to fight against. The Crusader Knights are taking casualties, their horses are being wounded, and they cannot reach the enemy to deliver their devastating charge. After several days of this harassment, Kaloyan executes a feigned retreat.
The Cumans ride in, fire their arrows, and then suddenly turn their horses and appear to flee the battlefield in total panic.
Exactly. And the Latin heavy cavalry, losing their tactical discipline and just eager to finally run down the retreating nomads, they break their defensive formations. Emperor Baldwin I and his knights charge wildly after the fleeing Cumans.
And the Cumans lead them exactly where Kaloyan wants them.
The light, fast Cuman horses easily outpace the heavily armored war horses of the Crusaders. The Cumans lead the exhausted, disorganized Latin knights directly into the marshy terrain, right into the waiting ranks of the heavy Bulgarian infantry.
The heavy Crusader horses just sink into the mud. They lose all their momentum.
The charge is completely neutralized. The Bulgarian infantry surrounds them, pulling the knights from their horses. The Latin army is comprehensively annihilated. Emperor Baldwin I is captured alive on the battlefield and taken back to Tarnovo in chains.
That sequence, sedentary infantry anchoring a trap specifically set by nomadic light cavalry executing a feigned retreat, it dismantled the most feared military force in Western Europe. It definitively secured the Second Bulgarian Empire's position as the dominant power in the Balkans.
It established a very robust military and territorial foundation. The next phase of the empire is defined by how that foundation is utilized to achieve absolute hegemony.
Which moves us from the foundational wars of Kaloyan into the era of Ivan Asen II, who rules from 1218 to 1241. And this period is universally recognized as the golden age of the Second Bulgarian Empire.
Well, Ivan Asen II had to depose his cousin Boril to secure the throne in 1218, but once his domestic position was solidified, his approach to expansion was notably different from his predecessors.
In what way?
He was less of a pure battlefield commander and more of a grand strategist. He relied heavily on complex diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances, and highly calculated military strikes.
The defining geopolitical event of his reign is the Battle of Klokotnitsa in 1230.
Yes, by 1230, the balance of power in the region had shifted again. The most powerful Byzantine successor state, so the Greek factions that survived the Crusader sack of Constantinople, was the Despotate of Epirus, ruled by a man named Theodore Komnenos Doukas.
Theodore has been highly successful at this point. He has conquered the city of Thessaloniki and actually proclaimed himself emperor, setting his sights on recapturing Constantinople from the Latins.
Right, and Theodore and Ivan Asen II had previously negotiated a formal peace treaty to secure their borders. However, Theodore, feeling overconfident and wanting to completely secure his northern flank before launching an assault on Constantinople, decided to break the treaty.
He just ignores it.
He invaded Bulgarian territory with a massive army.
The historical chronicles estimate Theodore's invading force at 20,000 to 30,000 men. Ivan Asen II is caught somewhat off guard by this sudden betrayal.
He had to act immediately. He hastily gathered a much smaller force, perhaps only a few thousand men, which crucially included a rapid response detachment of 1,000 Cuman cavalry, and marched south to intercept Theodore's massive army near the village of Klokotnitsa.
And facing overwhelming numerical odds, Ivan Asen II executes one of the most cinematic pieces of psychological warfare in medieval history. He doesn't just march his army out under a standard royal banner.
No. He took the physical parchment document of the peace treaty that Theodore had signed and subsequently violated.
The actual parchment.
Yes, the parchment. This parchment contained Theodore's written oath and his royal wax seal. Ivan Asen II ordered the treaty to be impaled on the point of a long spear.
That's incredibly dramatic.
He rode into battle with the broken treaty held high as a standard for both armies to see.
He is visually framing the battle not as a territorial dispute, but as a divine judgment against a perjurer. He is calling upon God to punish the man who broke a sacred oath.
And the psychological impact on both sides was profound. It galvanized the heavily outnumbered Bulgarian forces with a sense of righteous fury, and it likely demoralized the Epirot soldiers who knew their commander was in the wrong.
Right.
Against overwhelming numerical odds, the Bulgarian army completely routed the Epirot forces. Theodore Komnenos was captured alive, along with his entire royal court and his family.
And following this massive victory, Ivan Asen II does something highly unusual for a medieval monarch. Instead of slaughtering or enslaving the captured common soldiers, he releases them.
He demonstrated profound clemency, allowing the ordinary Epirot soldiers to return to their homes unharmed. This act won him immense political goodwill across the region. Following the disaster at Klokotnitsa, the Despotate of Epirus completely collapsed as a major power. Bulgarian forces just swept through the undefended territories.
The territorial expansion following this single battle is staggering. The empire stretches to its absolute maximum extent. We are talking about a continuous state that touches 3 major seas: the Black Sea to the east, the Adriatic Sea to the west, and the Aegean Sea to the south.
Ivan Asen II now directly controlled Thrace, Macedonia, Thessaly, and parts of Albania. Furthermore, he exacted formal tribute from the remaining fragmented Epirot territories and from the neighboring kingdom of Serbia. Tarnovo was the undisputed hegemon of southeastern Europe.
And territorial hegemony on that scale triggers an economic boom. The trade routes from the Adriatic to the Black Sea are secured. We see the physical evidence of this economic explosion in the numismatic record. Ivan Asen II is the very first Bulgarian ruler to mint his own coins.
The act of minting currency is the ultimate declaration of absolute sovereignty. Prior to his reign, the Bulgarian economy relied on circulating Byzantine or Latin Crusader currency. By establishing organized mints, Tarnovo was declaring itself a true imperial center, equal to Constantinople.
Let's examine the physical coins themselves, because they are deeply communicative. The most famous example from this era is a stunning 16-karat gold coin known as a purpera, which was discovered in a hoard near the city of Prilep.
The Prilep purpera is a masterclass in political messaging. Physically, it weighs 4.33 grams and is 33 millimeters in diameter.
Okay.
It is struck in a cyphate or slightly cup-shaped form, which deliberately mimics the traditional Byzantine imperial style. But the imagery pressed into the gold is uniquely Bulgarian.
The reverse of the coin shows a standard depiction of Christ Pantocrator. But the obverse, the front of the coin, features a highly specific scene. It depicts Ivan Asen II standing upright, and standing directly next to him is Saint Demetrius of Thessaloniki.
Which brings us back to the foundational myth of the empire, this same saint who supposedly defected from the Byzantines to support Peter and Asen back in 1185.
Mm.
But you have to look at the exact gesture Saint Demetrius is performing on the coin.
It is a dual action. With one hand, the saint is reaching out and placing a royal crown on the head of Ivan Asen II. Simultaneously, with his other hand, the saint is handing the Tsar a sword.
That specific dual gesture, bestowing both the crown of political legitimacy and the sword of military might at the exact same moment, is entirely unique.
Right.
You do not see this in any prior Byzantine or Slavonic numismatic traditions. It is a bold, permanent declaration stamped in gold that Ivan Asen's vast 3C empire is both divinely ordained by heaven and militarily justified by conquest. It bypasses any need for recognition from the Pope or a Byzantine emperor. The authority comes directly from the saint.
And he matches this declaration of political independence with a massive move toward religious independence.
He does. In 1235, Ivan Asen II orchestrates the formal restoration of the autocephalous, or fully independent, Bulgarian Patriarchate.
Which means breaking the diplomatic alignment with the Pope in Rome that his uncle Kaloyan had established back in 1204.
The geopolitical winds had shifted dramatically. The Latin Empire in Constantinople was weakening, and the Orthodox Byzantine successor state, the Empire of Nicaea, was growing stronger. Ivan Asen II negotiates a complex treaty with the Empire of Nicaea.
And what's the deal?
In exchange for a military alliance against the Latins, the Nicene Emperor and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch officially recognized the Patriarch of Tarnovo as an equal autocephalous head of the church.
So this completely severs the temporary ties with the Catholic West, reestablishes Bulgaria firmly within the Orthodox Eastern tradition, and cements the capital of Tarnovo as a major independent religious center for the Slavic world.
It was the absolute zenith of the state's power, wealth, and international prestige.
But I want to push back on this a bit, because if you look at a map of the empire in 1235, it is deeply impressive. But I look at those borders stretching from the Black Sea across rugged mountain ranges all the way to ports on the Adriatic and the Aegean, and I question the sustainability of this golden age. Was expanding so rapidly across such diverse, difficult terrain actually a massive logistical nightmare? Did acquiring all this territory in a single generation sow the seeds for the empire's later inability to defend its own borders?
That is the structural paradox of medieval empires. When a state expands that quickly, it absorbs diverse, sometimes hostile populations. It stretches its military supply lines to the breaking point. But most importantly, because the central administration lacks the technology and bureaucracy to manage distant provinces directly, it is forced to rely on a decentralized feudal system to govern.
Because Tarnovo cannot micromanage tax collection or raise a local militia in a port city on the Adriatic coast, the communication time alone makes it impossible.
Precisely. To understand why this vast, powerful state eventually fractured and collapsed, we have to examine exactly how it was administered internally, and why the mechanics of that system contained fatal flaws.
So the governance structure at the top heavily borrowed from the established Byzantine administrative models.
Right. The state was a czarist autocracy. The ruler was officially styled as the emperor and autocrat of all Bulgarians. However, the Tsar did not govern in absolute isolation. His decisions were shaped and constrained by the Boyar Council.
The boyars being the entrenched, wealthy nobility.
Exactly. The council was composed of the greater boyars, so the most powerful aristocratic families, and the Patriarch of the Church. This council advised the Tsar on matters of war, foreign alliances, and the signing of treaties. Below the council were the high offices of state, many of which were direct translations of Byzantine Greek titles.
For example, the Great Logothete.
The Great Logothete functioned essentially as a first minister or chancellor, managing the daily operations of the central administration. You also had the protovestiarios, who was the head of the treasury, responsible for finance, taxation, and the minting of those gold coins.
That is the central government in Tarnovo. But what does the broader social fabric look like out in the provinces? How is the population stratified?
Medieval Bulgarian society was a rigid three-tiered hierarchy. You had the clergy, the nobility, and the peasantry. The clergy, particularly the large monastic complexes, held vast tracts of land that were entirely tax-exempt. The nobility, the boyars, were subdivided into greater and lesser lords. They controlled massive agricultural estates known as zadrugi.
Just how large is a zadrugi?
A single zadrugi, belonging to a powerful boyar, could encompass tens or even hundreds of individual villages, along with all the agricultural surplus those villages produced.
And the people living in those villages generating that surplus are the peasantry. They form the vast demographic majority of the empire.
Yes. The peasantry was broadly subdivided into two primary legal classes, the peretsi and the atratsi.
If you are a peasant working the land, what is the practical difference between those two classes?
Both classes could own small plots of land, livestock, and agricultural tools. The critical legal distinction was the right of inheritance. The peretsi were personally free to a degree. They had the legal right to inherit their property and pass their land, their tools, and their wealth down to their children.
Which allows for at least some generational stability.
Yes. The atratsi, however, lacked that fundamental right. They worked land that was entirely owned by the feudal lord. They could amass personal tools or a small herd during their lifetime, but upon their death, the inheritance rights reverted directly to the lord.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is harsh.
The lord could claim their property, leaving the atratsi's children with nothing. They were far more dependent and vulnerable to the whims of the boyar.
But the mechanism that truly drives the entire state apparatus, the engine that funds the government and raises the military, is the pronoia system.
The pronoia system is the foundational structure of medieval Balkan feudalism. Because the central treasury did not collect enough physical coin to maintain a massive standing professional army, the Tsar paid for defense with land. The Tsar would grant a parcel of land, or more accurately, the right to extract all tax revenues from the peasants on that land to a nobleman.
And in exchange for that revenue stream.
In exchange, that nobleman was legally obligated to provide military service. He used the extracted wealth to equip himself with heavy armor, war horses, and weapons, and he was required to maintain a contingent of armed soldiers. Whenever the Tsar declared war, the nobleman had to march his contingent to the muster point.
Let's look at the long-term mechanics of this system. Imagine a minor noble who is granted a pronoia estate on the frontier in Macedonia. Over the decades, he collects all the local taxes, he raises and pays the local troops, he administers local justice. By granting land for defense, the Tsar is essentially franchising his military and his administration.
That's a good way to look at it.
And the fatal flaw here is that as these franchisees build up their local wealth and their local armies, the central authority in Tarnovo loses all quality control. The local peasants don't view the distant Tsar as their ruler. They view the local lord who taxes them as their ruler.
You have identified the exact mechanism of the empire's eventual collapse. In the short term, a pronoia system is a highly efficient way to rapidly raise an army without needing a centralized tax bureaucracy. But over generations, it systematically drains power from the capital. These provincial boyars utilize the pronoia revenues to build their own impregnable fortresses and establish their own local power bases.
They stop acting like state officials and start acting like independent warlords.
Exactly. If the Tsar sitting in Tarnovo shows any political weakness, or if a succession crisis occurs, these powerful provincial lords simply stop answering the call to arms. They keep the tax revenue for themselves. Some of them even begin minting their own crude, localized coinage to further assert their independence from the capital.
And we see the direct result of this decentralization in the composition of the military, don't we? The state moves away from relying on the native peasant levies and the deeply integrated cumens.
Yes, by the 14th century, the central authority in Tarnovo was so eroded that the Tsars could no longer rely on the pronoia levies of their own nobility. The boyars simply refused to send their troops. Therefore, to fight external wars or even to suppress internal rebellions, the central government became overwhelmingly reliant on hiring foreign mercenaries paid in hard cash.
We're talking about hiring Mongol cavalry detachments, Ossetian warriors from the Caucasus, Russian mercenaries, and Wallachian light infantry.
Right. And when an empire is forced to hire foreign fighters to defend its core territories because its own aristocratic class refuses to fulfill their feudal obligations, it indicates deep systemic rot. The social contract of the state has failed.
And that internal structural rot cracks wide open upon the arrival of a massive, unprecedented external threat.
We enter the late 13th century. This is a period characterized by catastrophic geopolitical decline and, frankly, one of the most bizarre, fascinating events in all of medieval history.
Following the death of Ivan Asen II in 1241, the powerful Asen dynasty falls into a prolonged period of severe dynastic instability. You have a rapid succession of child rulers, corrupt regencies, palace coups, and assassinations.
And this internal political vacuum coincides perfectly with the worst possible external event, the expansion of the Mongol Empire into Europe.
Starting around 1241 and peaking in intensity in 1256, the Mongol armies sweep through Eastern Europe. They desolate Hungary and Poland, and the Bulgarian lands are heavily targeted.
The chronicles describe the terror of the godless Tatars. Because the Bulgarian state was politically fractured and the Bulgars refused to unite their forces, it was impossible to mount a coordinated defense. The Golden Horde swept through the territories. To avoid total annihilation, the Bulgarian Tsar was forced to submit to formal vassalage under the Mongols.
This vassalage requires paying crippling amounts of silver and goods as tribute to the Golden Horde.
Paying the tribute drained the treasury, but worse were the physical consequences. The Golden Horde frequently launched massive pillage raids deep into the Bulgarian countryside, devastating the agricultural infrastructure and capturing thousands of people to be sold into slavery.
This dual trauma, the internal failure of the state and the external terror of the Mongols, creates the specific conditions for the peasant revolt of 1277. It is led by a man named Ivailo, known to history by the derogatory title of the Swineherd Tsar.
The story of Ivailo is an incredible historical anomaly. He was a commoner, literally a peasant, who tended herds of pigs in the countryside.
A literal pig herder.
Yes, and he capitalized on the unbearable dual pressures that were crushing the Bulgarian peasantry.
Break down the exact pressures that drove a populace to follow a pig herder.
First, you have the constant, horrific reality of the Tatar raids. The wealthy boyars, the belators, the aristocratic class, whose entire societal justification for their wealth and status was that they provided military protection, were failing completely.
Right.
When the Tatar raiding parties arrived, the boyars retreated behind the stone walls of their fortresses, abandoning the undefended agricultural villages to be burned and pillaged.
They abdicate their fundamental feudal duty.
But the second pressure is that despite completely failing to provide protection, these same boyars continued to extract crippling feudal taxation and labor from the surviving peasants. They needed the resources to fund their petty, localized civil wars against rival lords.
So the peasantry is trapped in a vice. They are being slaughtered and robbed by the Tatars from the outside and simultaneously taxed into starvation by their own lords from the inside.
In this desperate environment, Ivailo steps forward. He claims to be experiencing divine, mystical visions. He preaches that God has ordained him to save the people because the nobility has failed. He rallies a massive, ad hoc army of desperate peasants. And remarkably, they achieve the impossible.
They actually managed to fight off the Mongols.
This peasant militia, fighting with agricultural tools and captured weapons, manages to ambush and definitively defeat several major Tatar raiding parties in the field, actively driving them back across the Danube River.
A mobilized peasantry achieves the military victory that the heavily armed, professional nobility was too cowardly or divided to attempt.
Because of this unprecedented military success against the Mongols, Ivailo's movement gained immense legitimacy. The peasant army then turned its anger toward the corrupt Bulgarian central government. Ivailo marched his forces on the capital of Tarnovo.
And the reigning monarch, Tsar Constantine Tik, marched out with the royal army to crush the rebellion.
Yes, but in the ensuing battle, the royal forces were defeated, and Tsar Constantine Tik was personally killed in combat by Ivailo.
A common pig herder kills the anointed emperor on the battlefield.
Following the victory, in 1278, Ivailo entered the capital of Tarnovo. In a desperate attempt to stabilize the realm, he married the widowed Empress Maria and was officially crowned Tsar of the Second Bulgarian Empire.
Look at the sheer improbability of this event. A commoner successfully overthrows an entrenched, wealthy nobility, defeats nomadic raiding parties that terrified all of Europe, and temporarily seizes the throne of a major European power.
His reign was inevitably brief. The neighboring Byzantine Empire panicked at the very concept of a successful peasant revolt, fearing the ideology might spread across the border to their own heavily taxed peasantry, and they intervened militarily.
And the local lords pushed back too.
Right. Simultaneously, the surviving Bulgarian boyars regrouped, utilizing their remaining wealth to hire mercenaries. Ivailo was eventually forced to flee the capital and was subsequently murdered by a Mongol warlord with whom he had desperately sought refuge.
While the reign was short, what does Ivailo's uprising reveal about the underlying mechanics of medieval society in the Balkans?
It reveals the catastrophic breakdown of the fundamental feudal social contract. The entire medieval order rested on a strict agreement. The labradors, the peasantry, engaged in grueling physical labor to feed and enrich the belators, the nobility. In exchange, the nobility risked their lives in combat to protect the peasantry.
Which they completely stopped doing.
When the Boyars failed to provide protection from the Mongols but continued to demand the agricultural surplus, the contract was broken. Ivaylo's success proved that the traditional state apparatus was entirely hollowed out, existing only to extract wealth rather than govern or defend.
Despite this period of deep chaos, the humiliation of Mongol vassalage, and the trauma of massive peasant uprisings, the empire doesn't die here. It actually manages to pull itself back from the brink of total collapse and enter one final, highly influential era.
We move into the 14th century, specifically focusing on the long reign of Ivan Alexander, who ruled from 1331 to 1371.
Ivan Alexander manages to halt the political freefall and stabilize the state machinery.
He achieved stabilization largely through highly pragmatic diplomacy, rather than conquest. He recognized the shifting geopolitics of the region, specifically the rapid rise of the Serbian Empire to the west. On Easter Sunday in 1332, he cemented a lasting non-aggression pact and alliance with the powerful Serbian king Stefan Uroš IV Dusan.
And he seals this through marriage.
Yes,
Yeah.
He sealed this alliance by marrying his sister Helena to the Serbian monarch.
But how does he address the internal rot? Because the provincial boyars are still acting like independent warlords.
Ivan Alexander realized he could not forcibly strip the boyars of their power without triggering a massive civil war. So he embraced the decentralization, but attempted to keep it within the family. He instituted a formal system of co-emperors.
Okay.
He crowned his eldest sons as royal co-rulers and dispatched them to govern vital, semi-autonomous regions of the empire, such as Vidin in the northwest and Preslav in the east.
It's a calculated gamble. He is attempting to project royal authority into the rebellious provinces by placing his own bloodline in charge, hoping they will remain loyal to the capital rather than relying solely on local lords whose loyalties are always transactional.
And this political stabilization allows for a significant economic recovery. It is during Ivan Alexander's 40-year reign that we see the absolute climax in domestic coin minting. The sheer volume of currency indicates a revived, highly monetized, and active trade economy.
The numismatic evidence from his reign is incredibly abundant, and again, the imagery tells us exactly what the central government wanted the population to focus on.
We find massive quantities of specific silver coins from this era. The obverse depicts Christ standing upright, offering a blessing. But the reverse is highly political. It depicts Tsar Ivan Alexander standing next to his son and designated heir, the co-emperor Michael Asen.
And what are they doing in the image?
The two figures are depicted holding a large, prominent flag between them.
It is a visual broadcast of dynastic continuity and stability. He is telling the populace and the rebellious lords that the succession is secure.
Even more widespread were the common copper coins used for daily transactions in the markets. There is a very specific, fascinating type of copper coin from his reign.
Oh, the castle ones.
Yes. The front simply displays the emperor's royal monogram, but the back features a highly stylized architectural depiction of a castle with three prominent towers, accompanied by an inscription in the Bulgarian language that reads, Tarnovo.
It is the only time in the medieval period that we see the capital city itself depicted as the primary symbol on the currency. That image of the three-towered castle was so potent and recognizable that it was actually adopted and remains the central feature of the coat of arms for the modern city of Veliko Tarnovo today.
But the true, enduring legacy of Ivan Alexander's reign isn't his pragmatic diplomacy or his stabilized economy. It is the culture. This period is defined by a massive, unprecedented cultural and religious renaissance.
The 14th century in Bulgaria sees an explosion of architectural construction, literary production, and theological innovation that rivals anything occurring in Constantinople.
To understand this cultural explosion, we have to start with the theology, because the religious movements fundamentally influence the literature and the art. This era sees the meteoric rise of a movement called hesychasm.
The word hesychasm comes from the Greek term for stillness or silence. But what are the actual mechanics of this practice? What were these monks actually doing?
Hesychasm is a deeply mystical, Eremitic Orthodox tradition. It revolves around a highly disciplined physical and mental technique of prayer. Monks would retreat into total isolation, often sitting in darkened caves or small cells.
Just completely alone.
Yes. They would adopt a specific physical posture, usually sitting with their chin resting on their chest, directing their gaze intently toward their navel.
It sounds similar to Eastern meditation practices.
It shares physiological similarities for sure. While holding this posture, They would strictly regulate their breathing, slowing it down dramatically while silently and continuously repeating the Jesus prayer. The psychological and physiological focus required was immense.
What is the theological goal of engaging in this intense, physically demanding meditation?
The ultimate theological objective was that, through this disciplined stillness and the complete emptying of the mind of worldly thoughts, a dedicated practitioner might actually be granted a vision of the divine uncreated light.
Uncreated light.
Yes, they believed this was the exact same physical light that the apostles witnessed emanating from Jesus during the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. It was the belief that a human being could directly, experientially encounter the divine energy of God in this life.
It is a deeply internal, mystical, and highly personal practice. And Tsar Ivan Alexander heavily patronizes these monks.
He provided massive state funding to construct secluded monasteries, specifically for hesychast leaders. The most famous was Gregory of Sinai, who established a major monastic center in the remote, rugged terrain of the Stransa Mountains. With imperial backing, this region became a spiritual magnet, drawing monks and scholars from across the entire Orthodox Balkans.
This intense spiritual revival acts as the catalyst for an intellectual one. The focus on theological purity directly fuels the creation of the Tarnovo literary school, which was led by an incredibly influential figure, Patriarch Euthemius of Tarnovo.
Patriarch Euthemius was a strict disciple of the hesychast tradition, completely devoted to the concept of divine purity. But he was also a brilliant scholar and a masterful linguistic organizer.
Euthemius undertakes a massive linguistic reform of the written language. Why was a reform necessary at this specific moment?
The problem was one of textual corruption. Over several centuries, as sacred texts and liturgies were manually copied and recopied by scribes across the vast Slavic world, subtle errors crept in. Translations from the original Byzantine Greek were often flawed or misinterpreted.
Because it's like a multi-generational game of telephone.
Exactly. Furthermore, the spoken Bulgarian language had naturally evolved phonetically over the centuries, but the written Cyrillic alphabet and orthography had not been updated to match.
So the letters on the page no longer accurately represented the sounds people were speaking?
Precisely. Certain Cyrillic letters were being used incorrectly, or they represented sounds that no longer existed in the spoken dialect. For a hesychast like Euthemius, who believed that encountering God required absolute purity, corrupted liturgical texts were a spiritual disaster. If the words used in the liturgy were wrong, the theology was wrong.
How does he fix the code of the culture? What are the mechanics of this reform?
Euthemius undertook a comprehensive standardization of the Middle Bulgarian language. He adapted the Cyrillic script, establishing rigid new orthographic rules to align the written text with current phonetics, while carefully preserving the sacred, historical roots of the alphabet.
And then he implements this system.
Once the rules were set, he organized massive scriptoria in Tarnovo. He set teams of highly trained monks to work systematically correcting, retranslating, and copying corrupted liturgical books based on the oldest, most accurate Greek models available. He demanded absolute theological and linguistic precision in every single written word.
And alongside this explosion of literature and texts, we see a parallel explosion in physical architecture and art.
The Tarnovo Artistic School produced phenomenal, enduring work during this period. The capital city itself was heavily fortified and expanded. The primary imperial complex, the Zaravets Fortress, was developed into a massive walled citadel spanning 52,000 square meters, densely packed with ornate churches, patriarchal administrative buildings, and royal palaces.
We also see incredible achievements in painting. The Boiana church frescoes, dating from 1259, were patronized by a man named Sebastocrator Kaloyan. He was a provincial noble, which demonstrates how widespread this cultural patronage was, even outside the capital.
And the art style is notable, too.
Right. The frescoes there feature lifelike, almost neoclassical donor portraits that display an emotional depth rarely seen in earlier rigid Byzantine styles. We also have the rock-hewn churches of Ivanovo, where vibrant, complex religious scenes are painted directly onto the rough surfaces of high cave walls.
It's a tremendous artistic output.
But I look at all of this, the massive fortress, the intricate frescoes, the complex linguistic reforms, the deep mystical theology, and it presents a profound paradox. The political reality of the late 14th century is that the Bulgarian state is fracturing. The central military is weak, relying entirely on paid foreign mercenaries. The borders are rapidly shrinking as regional lords declare independence. Why does an empire produce its most refined, transcendent art and its most sophisticated intellectual achievements precisely at the moment when it is politically dying?
It is a fascinating historical paradox, but it actually makes psychological sense. When external physical security collapses, a society frequently turns inward. If the Tsar can no longer expand his borders on a physical map, the society attempts to expand its spiritual and intellectual borders.
So it's a reaction to the chaos.
The rise of hesychasm, with its intense focus on internal stillness, silence, and retreating from the physical world, can be viewed as a direct psychological reaction to the chaos, violence, and political decay of the outside world. Furthermore, as the earthly power of the boyars and the Tsar crumbled, they desperately funneled their remaining wealth into funding these monasteries and artists.
They are buying a legacy.
They were attempting to secure a permanent legacy in heaven, because they knew their earthly legacy was disintegrating.
This cultural height, this explosion of art and theology, was the final bright flash before total political collapse.
The decentralization that began with the pronoia system reaches its terminal, fatal phase. By the late 14th century, the Second Bulgarian Empire has completely fractured into three separate, weak, and often hostile entities.
You have the Tsardom of Tarnovo in the center, struggling to maintain authority. You have the independent Tsardom of Vidin in the northwest. And you have the despotate of Dobruja breaking away in the northeast.
They are deeply divided, fighting amongst themselves, and they are facing a new, highly organized, and seemingly unstoppable military force expanding rapidly into the Balkans, the Ottoman Turks.
The fragmented Bulgarian states are entirely incapable of mounting a unified defense against the Ottoman war machine.
The Ottoman advance was methodical and devastating. In 1393, after a brutal, grinding three-month siege, the Ottoman armies breached the walls and captured the capital city of Tarnovo. The physical center of the empire was gone.
And what happens to the leadership?
Patriarch Euthemius, the brilliant scholar and leader of the literary school, was captured and sent into permanent exile.
The final, definitive political blow is struck 3 years later.
In 1396, a massive Western Crusader army, organized to halt the Ottoman advance, met the Ottoman forces at the Battle of Nicopolis. The Crusader army was comprehensively annihilated. Following this disastrous defeat, the Ottomans extinguished the last remaining independent Bulgarian stronghold at Van. The political state of the Second Bulgarian Empire officially ceased to exist. It was wiped off the map.
Usually when we study the fall of an empire, that is the end of the narrative. The armies are defeated, the capital burns, the territory is annexed, and the culture is slowly absorbed by the conquerors until it disappears. But that is not what happens here. The state died, but its culture did not. In fact, you could argue its culture survived the political collapse and essentially conquered its neighbors.
This is a highly unusual historical phenomenon that scholars refer to as the Second South Slavonic influence.
When the Ottomans breached the walls of Tarnovo in 1393, the brilliant scholars of the Tarnovo Literary School, the highly trained disciples of Patriarch Euthemius, were forced to run for their lives. They were forced into exile. Where did they go?
They carried whatever texts they could carry and fled to the remaining independent Orthodox states that had not yet fallen to the Ottomans. They migrated west into Serbia, they crossed the Danube into the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, and most importantly, they traveled far to the north, seeking refuge in the rising Russian principalities.
We track figures like Gregory Samblak, an incredibly prolific writer and cleric who takes the Bulgarian literary models and preaches them in Serbia and Moldavia. But the most consequential figure of this diaspora is a man named Cyprian.
Cyprian was a Bulgarian cleric of noble birth and a close, trusted associate of Patriarch Euthemius. Following the collapse of the Bulgarian state, Cyprian traveled north into the Russian lands. Through his immense intellectual capability and political acumen, he eventually rose to become the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Russes.
He became the head of the church there.
He became the absolute highest-ranking church official in the entire Russian Orthodox world.
And consider what Cyprian brings with him when he arrives in Moscow.
He brings the entire accumulated intellectual apparatus of the Tarnovo Literary School. He brings the meticulously corrected, standardized Church Slavonic liturgical books that Euthemius had ordered produced.
Right.
He brings the new rigid orthographic rules that define how the sacred language must be written. And crucially, he brings the deeply mystical ideology and physical practices of hesychasm.
He takes the refined, perfected culture of Tarnovo directly into the heart of nascent Moscow.
Cyprian's influence fundamentally shaped the cultural and religious trajectory of the Grand Principality of Moscow, as it rose to become the new center of the Orthodox world. The formal, highly rigid standard of Church Slavonic that officially replaced the local Russian vernacular in all church texts was a direct, unmodified import from Tarnovo.
That is a massive shift.
The new, emotionally expressive styles of writing hagiographies, the lives of the saints were seeded by these Bulgarian refugees. The very way Russian monks in the deep forest conceptualized prayer, silence, and the divine light was taught to them by the exiled disciples of Euthymius.
The Second Bulgarian Empire served as a massive, vital historical bridge. It accumulated the theological, artistic, and linguistic knowledge of the Orthodox Balkans, refined it to an unprecedented level of sophistication during its own political collapse, and then transferred that perfected knowledge directly into the Russian state, fundamentally shaping the future of Eastern Europe for centuries to come.
It stands as one of the most successful, far-reaching cultural transmissions in European history.
Which brings me to a final concept to mull over. Consider that the concept of a nation surviving its own political death is exceptionally rare. If the Ottomans had not conquered Tarnovo in 1393, if those scholars hadn't been forced by extreme violence to pack up their books and run for their lives into exile, their standardized language, their corrected liturgies, and their mystical theology might have remained permanently localized in the Balkans. They might never have crossed the steppes to reach Russia. Did the violent, absolute destruction of the Second Bulgarian Empire actually ensure its cultural immortality across a much larger slice of the globe? It all started with an arrogant Byzantine official slapping a minor noble over a wedding tax, and it ended with the linguistic and spiritual DNA of Tarnovo shaping the foundations of the Russian Empire.
It is a stunning historical irony. A single spark that burned down one empire, built another, and ultimately illuminated half a continent.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.